Welcome back to our Principles of Microeconomics video series. In recent videos, we've examined how competition and monopoly produce very different outcomes. However, neither is a realistic example of an actual market. Very few markets involve many producers producing identical goods at a similar price, and very few goods have no close substitutes. Instead, oligopoly, where there are a few sellers of a good, and imperfect competition, where there are lots of sellers of goods that are similar but not identical, are more like the real-world markets that you experience every day. We will study oligopoly before we turn to imperfectly competitive markets. Let's get to it. Because oligopoly features a few producers interacting with one another strategically, we need to use game theory to study the effect an oligopoly market structure will have on market equilibrium outcomes. First, note that every game consists of three components: players, strategies, and payoffs. Let's illustrate this with a classic game known as the Prisoner's Dilemma. In the Prisoner's Dilemma, you and your partner in crime, let's call her Josie, get busted for a robbery. The police separate you for questioning at the police station and offer each of you a deal. If you both confess, you each get 5 years in prison. If only you confess, you walk free because you agree to testify against Josie, and Josie will get 10 years in prison. If neither one of you confesses, you each get 2 years in prison. Notice that this game has players, you and Josie. It has strategies. You can either confess or you can hold out. And there are payoffs. You can get 2 years in jail, 5 years, or 10 years. Crucially though, your time in prison depends on Josie's behavior, and her time in prison depends on your behavior, your strategy. We can represent this game visually. In the image on screen, your choices are represented as rows. We say you are the row player, and Josie's are columns. She is the column player. Each box represents a potential outcome of the game. For example, if you confess, you get 5 years in prison if Josie also confesses, but you are released if Josie holds out. If you hold out, you get 10 years in prison if Josie confesses, and you get 2 years if Josie holds out. You might be wondering, what has this got to do with economics? So before we determine what will happen to you and Josie, let me tell you a quick story about the US Congress's efforts to ban cigarette advertising in 1970. In the late 1960s, cigarette consumption in the United States was much more common than today. For example, about 43% of adults smoked cigarettes regularly in 1965. These days, fewer than 14% of adults smoke cigarettes regularly. With the risks of smoking becoming clearer every day, there was a big political push to ban cigarette advertising in the United States. To begin that process, Congress held a hearing where those in favor and against the plan to ban advertising could present their cases. At the time, a number of large and well-connected companies, including Philip Morris, R.J. Reynolds, and the British American Tobacco Company, produced most of the popular brands of cigarettes, including Camel, Marlboro, Winston, and Lucky Strike. You might expect that these companies would mount a furious defense of their industry when faced with the threat of an advertising ban. But, somewhat curiously, not a single representative from the cigarette industry showed up to argue against this proposed ban. Game theory is going to be key to understanding why. But first, let's make our way back to the police station. So we need to figure out what's going to happen to you and Josie. To do so, let's first think about your options if Josie will confess. If that's her choice, then if you choose to confess, you'll get 5 years in prison, and if you hold out, you'll get 10 years in prison. So confessing is your best option. Now let's consider what happens if you think Josie will hold out. If you choose to confess, you get released, and if you hold out, you get 10 years in prison. So again, confessing is your best option. But wait, that means that regardless of Josie's choice, it's best if you confess. You're better off either way. For Josie, she's going to face the exact same dilemma and should also realize that confessing is the best option for her, just as it is for you. So in equilibrium, for both of you, no matter what the other does, the best thing to do is to confess. We say here that confessing is a dominant strategy. It's the best strategy you can choose, regardless of the other player's behavior. We can see that the outcome where you both confess is an equilibrium by noting that no one has an incentive to change their choice. If you switch your choice, you can only be worse off, assuming that you're changing unilaterally so that Josie doesn't change her choice at the same time. So we assume all else equal, as we usually do. And the same is true for Josie. If she changes her choice, she's not going to be better off. She's going to get more time in prison from switching away from her dominant strategy of confessing. When we talk about games, the equilibrium is typically referred to as a Nash equilibrium, named in honor of the famous Nobel Prize-winning economist who first developed this concept, John Nash. I say famous because Russell Crowe portrayed John Nash in the award-winning movie A Beautiful Mind, and the movie won 4 Oscars in 2001, including Best Picture. Notice in The Prisoner's Dilemma that the equilibrium is non-cooperative, in the sense that if you and Josie were somehow to coordinate or cooperate on your strategies, you could both be better off. Let's figure out the Nash equilibrium for another game. In our next game, we've got 2 surf shops, La Jolla and Hang 10. Those are our players, and they have strategies. They can either advertise or not advertise, and they have payoffs, as you can see in the graphic on screen. These numbers represent profits per day, net of any advertising costs. First, let's think about what Hang 10 should do if they think La Jolla will advertise. Well, if Hang 10 advertises, they earn $400, and if they don't, La Jolla will steal some of their customers and they'll only earn $300. So they should advertise if La Jolla advertises. Now, let's think about what Hang 10 should do if they think La Jolla won't advertise. In that case, if Hang 10 advertises, they will earn $700, and if they don't, they'll earn $800. So they should not advertise if La Jolla does not advertise. Notice that Hang 10 doesn't have a dominant strategy here. Their best strategy is just to do whatever La Jolla does. Note that the same is also true for La Jolla because their problem is the same. We say it's a symmetric game. Again, we can see that these outcomes where both La Jolla and Hang 10 advertise or neither of them advertises are equilibrium outcomes because no one has an incentive to change their choice when they're already at one of these outcomes. For example, if Hang 10 switches their choice in either of the potential equilibria, they can only be worse off. They'll make 700 versus 800 and 300 versus 400. And the same is true for La Jolla if they were to unilaterally change their choice. Unilateral just meaning all alone or acting on their own. In the surf shop example, there were 2 potential equilibria. One of them was that both shops advertise, and the other was where neither of them were to advertise. If they both advertise, they each make $400 per day, and if neither advertises, they each make $800 per day. If they could somehow cooperate to not advertise, they would both be better off. What would also make them better off is if someone simply banned them from advertising at all. Then both would be forced to not advertise, ensuring that they make greater profits, because they're forced to stop spending money trying to attract the other shop's customers. This brings us right back to 1970 and Congress's plan to ban cigarette advertising. With so many adults smoking regularly, each cigarette producer was essentially just spending money trying to attract smokers from their competitors, while simultaneously having their own customers tempted away by their competitors' advertising. As an industry, they were stuck in the bad equilibrium like La Jolla and Hang 10 might be. They were each advertising because if they didn't, they'd lose their customers to the other companies. So they needed a savior. They needed someone to force them all to stop advertising. And the US Congress offered to do just that. And that's why no one showed up to argue against the cigarette advertising ban. In our examples up to now, there was a way for everybody to do well. The games could be what's called positive sum. But some games are zero sum. That just means for every winner, there has to be a loser. Rock, paper, scissors is an example of a zero-sum game. Your best choice always changes depending on the choice of your opponent. That just means there's no dominant strategy. You can't always play scissors and win. Also, it means that you have no pure strategy. Instead, we say you have to mix it up, randomly choosing rock, paper, or scissors in each round. Another example of a zero-sum game is penalty kicks in soccer. There are players, the kicker and the goalkeeper. There are strategies. The kicker can kick left or kick right, and the goalkeeper can guess left or guess right. And there are payoffs. The kicker either scores or misses, or the goalkeeper can save or concede a goal. When we look at the situation where both goalie and kicker choose to go left, then the goalie will succeed and the kicker fails. But this isn't an equilibrium. The kicker would like to go right if they knew that the goalkeeper was going left. So the only Nash equilibrium here is for both to randomly choose right or left. We say that they employ a mixed strategy. The games we've looked at up to now were all presented in what is known as normal form. This works great when players make choices simultaneously, but some games feature sequential choices, like chess, for example. When that's the case, we represent the game using a game tree, where decisions occur at nodes on the tree and the decision maker is aware of all previous decisions in the game. On screen now, you'll see an example. You and your business partner Gina have to make decisions about working or surfing. So we have our players, you and Gina, and we have their available strategies. They can either work or they can surf, and we can determine the payoffs from the information on screen. For example, if you both choose to work, then you both get $400. If you both choose to surf, you both get $200. To solve these extensive form games, you need to use what's called backward induction. That just means you have to consider the final decision maker's choice and then work your way back to the beginning of the problem. Let's illustrate this technique using the example on screen. We first examine Gina's decisions because she chooses last, and then we're going to work backwards. So looking at Gina's choice, if you choose to work, then she will get 400 if she chooses to work and 500 if she chooses to surf. So she's going to choose to surf. It gives her a better payoff. In contrast, if you choose to surf, Gina will be better off from working, 300 versus 200. Now, working backwards, you know that if you choose to work, Gina will choose to surf and your payoff will be 300. And if you surf, you know Gina will choose to work and your payoff will be 500. Your choice therefore is simple, and the Nash equilibrium will be where you choose to surf and Gina has no other option but to choose to work. Of course, if Gina could somehow credibly commit to not working, let's say she threw the keys to your workplace in the ocean, then you would have a very different outcome, as you can see now on screen. Finally, notice that if you draw this game in normal form and assume that the decisions are made at the same time rather than sequentially, you can get different outcomes and more than one equilibrium. I encourage you to try that on your own. What we've done in this video is to introduce the use of game theory in economics. In our next video, we're going to use these tools to analyze strategic interaction between sellers in what are called oligopolistic markets. I'll see you in the next one.